Intro. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe lay in ruins, divided, devastated, and uncertain of its future. But from the ashes of destruction, a new chapter began. This is the story of Europe's transformation, of Cold War rivalries and peaceful revolutions, of collapsing empires and rising unions, of economic miracles and devastating crises. From the Iron Curtain to the European Union, from Wirtschaftswunder wonder to Brexit, and from student protests to digital revolutions, the continent has been reshaped time and again. Join us as we journey through 75 years of European history, tracing the political, social, and economic forces that have shaped the Europe we know today, from 1950 to 2025. 1950s, post-war recovery and integration, Cold War division. After World War II, Europe was divided into two ideological and military blocs: the capitalist West, led by the United States and organized under NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union and aligned through the Warsaw Pact. This division created the Iron Curtain, symbolizing the sharp boundary between democracy and communism across the continent. Marshall Plan, officially known as the European Recovery Program. The Marshall Plan was a U.S.-funded initiative that provided over $12 billion, about $150 billion today, in economic aid to help rebuild Western European countries after World War II. It played a crucial role in reviving industry, stabilizing currencies, and strengthening democratic governments, while also countering the spread of communism in war-torn nations. The beginning of European integration. In the aftermath of two devastating world wars, European nations sought lasting peace through economic cooperation. 1951. The European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, was established by 6 countries: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg Benelux. It aimed to place key war industries under shared control, making future conflict between members not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. 1957. Building on that success, the Treaty of Rome created the European Economic Community (EC), which laid the foundation for a common market and the free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. To 1960. Economic growth and social change. Post-war economic boom. During the 1950s and 1960s, Western Europe experienced rapid economic growth, often referred to as the economic miracle. In West Germany, this period was famously known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic wonder, driven by industrial modernization, Marshall Plan aid, and a highly skilled labor force. Similar booms occurred in France, Italy, and the Benelux countries, leading to rising living standards, consumerism, and the growth of a middle class. Decolonization of European empires. From the late 1940s through the 1970s, major European powers, especially France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Portugal, began dismantling their colonial empires. The UK granted independence to India in 1947, followed by many African and Caribbean nations. France faced violent conflicts in Indochina ending in 1954 and Algeria War from 1954 to 1962, eventually withdrawing from most African and Asian colonies. This wave of decolonization was fueled by anti-colonial movements, Cold War dynamics, and global pressure for self-determination, dramatically reshaping the global political map. Rise of social movements. The 1960s saw a surge in social and political activism across Europe. 1968 was a watershed year, marked by massive student protests and workers' strikes in countries like France, Italy, and West Germany, challenging traditional authority, capitalism, and conservative social norms. In France, the May 1968 protests nearly brought down the government. Simultaneously, civil rights movements, feminism, anti-nuclear campaigns, and environmental activism gained momentum, signaling a shift toward a more participatory and progressive political culture. The 1970s. Economic crisis and expansion, oil shocks and economic crisis. In 1973 and again in 1979, sharp increases in oil prices, triggered by geopolitical events like the Yom Kippur War and the Iranian Revolution, plunged Europe into economic turmoil. These oil shocks caused fuel shortages, skyrocketing energy costs, and triggered a period of stagflation, the rare combination of high inflation, rising unemployment, and slow economic growth. Western European governments struggled to maintain living standards, and the crisis exposed vulnerabilities in industrial economies heavily reliant on imported oil. 1973, first enlargement of the EEC. The European Economic Community, EEC, expanded for the first time in 1973, welcoming the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Denmark as new members. This marked a significant step in European integration, extending the EEC beyond its original 6 founding countries. Norway also held a referendum, but chose not to join, reflecting growing public debate over national sovereignty versus European cooperation. The UK's entry, after years of hesitation and 2 French vetoes, signaled a major shift in its post-imperial identity, aligning more closely with continental Europe. Rise of environmental and feminist movements. During the 1970s, Europe witnessed a surge in grassroots activism, particularly in environmentalism and women's rights. Environmental movements emerged in response to industrial pollution, nuclear energy concerns, and the oil crisis, leading to the birth of green parties, notably in Germany with Die Grünen in 1980. The feminist movement gained momentum across Europe, advocating for gender equality, reproductive rights, equal pay, and legal protections against discrimination and violence. These movements helped reshape public discourse, influence legislation, and push social issues to the forefront of European politics. Terrorism in 1970s to 1980s Europe. This period saw a rise in domestic terrorism, driven by political extremism and separatist movements. In West Germany, the Red Army faction RAF, a far-left militant group, carried out bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, targeting symbols of capitalism and the state. Their most notorious period, the German Autumn of 1977, included the kidnapping and murder of industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer. In the United Kingdom, the Irish Republican Army IRA waged a violent campaign to end British rule in Northern Ireland, using bombings and shootings in both Northern Ireland and mainland Britain. This conflict, known as the Troubles, lasted for decades and resulted in thousands of deaths. 1980s, Cold War tensions and reform. Thatcher and Mitterrand, contrasting political visions. In the 1980s, 2 influential European leaders, Margaret Thatcher in the UK and François Mitterrand in France, played major roles in shaping their countries' domestic policies, reflecting sharply different ideologies. Thatcher, the UK's first female prime minister 1979 to 1990, pursued free market reforms, privatization of state-owned industries, tax cuts, and curbs on trade unions, ushering in a new era of neoliberalism. Her policies were polarizing but transformed the British economy and state. Mitterrand, elected in 1981 as France's first socialist president, initially implemented nationalizations, social welfare expansion, and worker protections. However, by the mid-1980s, facing economic pressure, he shifted toward more market-friendly reforms, showing the limits of socialism in a globalizing economy. The Solidarity Movement in Poland 1980s. The Solidarity Movement in Poland, led by Lech Walesa, was a pivotal challenge to communist rule in Eastern Europe. Founded in 1980 in the Gdansk shipyard, Solidarity was initially a trade union formed in response to harsh working conditions and economic hardship. It quickly evolved into a broad-based social and political movement, advocating for workers' rights, political freedoms, and an end to communist dictatorship. Solidarity's peaceful protests, strikes, and negotiations forced the communist government to make significant concessions, including the establishment of free trade unions, In 1981, the government declared martial law to suppress solidarity, but the movement continued underground. By the mid-1980s, solidarity played a crucial role in Poland's transition from communism to democracy, inspiring similar movements in other Soviet-controlled states. Gorbachev's Glasnost and Perestroika, 1985 to 1991. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, he introduced two major reforms, Glasnost openness and Perestroika restructuring, that would significantly ease Cold War tensions and change the course of Soviet and global history. Glasnost encouraged greater freedom of speech, press freedom, and transparency within the Soviet system, allowing for public criticism of the government and the unveiling of past injustices such as Stalin's purges. Perestroika aimed at economic restructuring by decentralizing economic control, introducing market-like reforms, and promoting limited private ownership. It sought to modernize the Soviet economy, which was struggling under central planning. These reforms opened the door for political pluralism, social reforms, and a new era of diplomacy with the West, notably resulting in nuclear arms reduction agreements like the INF Treaty 1987. However, the unintended consequences of these reforms, including rising nationalistic movements within Soviet republics, contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Single European Act 1986. The Single European Act C, signed in 1986, was a landmark treaty that significantly advanced European integration by aiming to create a single European market. The C sought to eliminate remaining barriers to the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people across the European Economic Community EC, setting the groundwork for the completion of the internal market by 1992. It introduced important reforms, including qualified majority voting in the Council of the European Union, which streamlined decision-making and made it easier to pass legislation. The act also expanded cooperation in areas like environmental policy, regional development, and research and development, marking a shift toward greater policy coordination across European countries. 1990s, end of the Cold War and EU formation. 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991, collapse of the Soviet Union. The events of 1989 and 1991 marked the dramatic end of the Cold War and the division of Europe. 1989, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the Cold War divide between East and West, fell in November, following a series of peaceful protests and political changes in Eastern Europe. The fall of the wall not only reunified East and West Germany, but also sparked the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, ending over 70 years of communist rule. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, along with rising nationalist movements in the Soviet republics, led to the breakup of the USSR into 15 independent states. This marked the end of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe and fundamentally reshaped the political landscape. 1990, German reunification. In 1990, the reunification of Germany marked a historic moment in European history, symbolizing the end of the Cold War division. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, East Germany German Democratic Republic and West Germany Federal Republic of Germany began the process of political and economic integration. West Germany's Chancellor Helmut Kohl and East Germany's Prime Minister Hans Madel led negotiations, and the reunification was officially completed on October 3, 1990. This date became German Unity Day, marking the end of more than 40 years of division. The reunification process was complex, involving significant economic and social integration, including the extension of the West German economy and political system to the East. However, it also came with challenges like economic disparities and the integration of different political ideologies. Yugoslav Wars and ethnic conflict 1990s. Following the collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, a series of brutal ethnic conflicts broke out across the Balkans, leading to the Yugoslav Wars. The disintegration of Yugoslavia was sparked by rising nationalist movements, economic crises, and the weakening of the central communist government. Several republics declared independence, including Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, leading to violent conflicts. Bosnia and Herzegovina 1992 to 1995 saw some of the most horrific ethnic violence, with Serb forces engaging in ethnic cleansing against Bosniak Muslim and Croat populations. The siege of Sarajevo and the Srebrenica massacre became symbols of the atrocities committed during this period. The conflict in Kosovo 1998 to 1999 arose between ethnic Albanians seeking independence and the Serb-controlled Yugoslav government, resulting in widespread violence, NATO intervention, and the eventual declaration of independence by Kosovo in 2008. 1993, the Maastricht Treaty and the creation of the European Union (EU). In 1993, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, marking the formal creation of the European Union (EU). This treaty expanded the goals of European integration beyond just economic cooperation. It introduced political and economic union, with a focus on a single currency, common foreign and security policies, and increased cooperation on issues like justice and home affairs. The treaty established the framework for the euro and set the stage for its introduction in 1999 as the shared currency for EU members. It also expanded the EU's influence by establishing the European citizenship, allowing citizens to move, live, and work freely within member states, and enhancing the political and institutional structure of the EU. Eastern Europe transitions to democracy and capitalism 1990s. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe underwent a dramatic transformation as former communist states transitioned to democracy and capitalism. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others began implementing market reforms and democratic elections. The process was often difficult, marked by economic instability, privatization, and the dismantling of state-run industries. Poland was one of the first to make the shift, with Lech Walesa and the Solidarity movement playing a key role in the transition to democracy. The Czech Republic and Slovakia peacefully split in 1993, forming two independent democratic nations. The challenge of transitioning to a free market economy led to social hardships, including inflation, unemployment, and the rise of oligarchs in some countries. But by the mid-1990s, these nations began to see economic growth and improvements in living standards. Eastern Europe transitions to democracy and capitalism 1990s. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern European countries embarked on a historic transition from communism to democracy and capitalism. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others began the difficult process of dismantling state-controlled economies, introducing market reforms, and holding free elections. The Solidarity movement in Poland played a key role, leading to the first partially free elections in 1989 and the eventual establishment of a democratic government. Countries like Hungary implemented a series of economic reforms to embrace capitalism, while Czechoslovakia peacefully split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993. The transition was often rocky, with economic hardship, hyperinflation, and unemployment plaguing many nations. However, foreign investment, privatization of industries, and the establishment of democratic institutions began to stabilize the region. 2000s, enlargement and economic crisis. Introduction of the Euro 1999 to 2002. The Euro was introduced as the official currency of many EU countries in a multi-stage process between 1999 and 2002, marking a significant step in European integration. 1999. The Euro was first introduced in electronic form for banking and financial transactions, while national currencies continued to circulate alongside it. 2002. The Euro banknotes and coins were launched in 12 EU countries, replacing their national currencies. This was a monumental moment in the history of European integration, as it symbolized the creation of a single European market with one currency. Countries like Germany, France, Spain, and Italy were among the first to adopt the euro, while other nations, including the UK and Denmark, opted out. The adoption of the euro was aimed at fostering greater economic stability, trade efficiency, and price transparency across Europe. However, it also came with challenges, such as the loss of individual monetary control and the complex economic management of the currency across diverse national economies. 2004 and 2007. Massive EU expansion. Former Eastern Bloc countries joined. In two significant waves, the European Union (EU) underwent its largest enlargement in history, incorporating 10 countries in 2004 and 2 more in 2007, many of which were former Eastern Bloc states. 2004, the EU welcomed 10 new members, including Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Cyprus, and Malta. These countries had previously been under communist rule, but had embraced democracy and market reforms following the fall of the Berlin Wall. 2007. The EU further expanded with the inclusion of Romania and Bulgaria, completing a major step in the reunification of Eastern and Western Europe. This expansion was a historic moment, symbolizing the end of the Cold War divisions and the EU's role in promoting democracy, stability, and prosperity in the formerly communist regions. However, the enlargement also posed challenges, including economic disparities, institutional adjustments, and the integration of countries with diverse political and economic systems. 2008. Global financial crisis hits Europe. The global financial crisis of 2008 had a profound impact on Europe, causing significant economic turmoil, particularly in the Eurozone. The crisis was triggered by the collapse of major financial institutions in the United States and the global recession that followed, affecting Europe's interconnected economies. Greece, Spain, and Portugal were among the hardest hit countries, experiencing severe economic recessions, rising unemployment, and mounting national debts. Greece was particularly affected by high levels of public debt and deficits, leading to a financial bailout package from the EU and International Monetary Fund (IMF) in 2010, which came with strict austerity measures aimed at reducing the national debt. Similarly, Spain and Portugal faced significant challenges with their banking sectors and were forced to implement austerity programs. The crisis exposed weaknesses in the Eurozone's financial structure, particularly the lack of a unified fiscal policy, and raised questions about the viability of the single currency without a centralized fiscal union. EU austerity measures caused protests and political unrest 2010s. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the austerity measures imposed on struggling EU countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal sparked widespread protests and political unrest. Austerity, which included cuts to public spending, wage reductions, higher taxes, and pension reforms, was seen by many as a harsh response to the crisis that disproportionately affected ordinary citizens while aiming to reduce national debt and restore market confidence. In Greece, austerity measures led to large-scale protests, with violent demonstrations erupting in the streets of Athens. The Greek debt crisis and subsequent bailout programs conditions set by the EU and the IMF led to public anger, fueling the rise of populist political movements like the left-wing Syriza Party, which opposed austerity. Similarly, in Spain, the Indignados movement, or 15M movement, emerged in 2011, with citizens protesting high unemployment, cuts to social services, and the lack of political accountability. The movement's slogan, "We are not commodities in the hands of politicians and bankers," resonated across Europe. In Portugal, there were also mass demonstrations against austerity measures, including general strikes and anti-government protests. Many viewed the austerity as deepening inequality and worsening economic conditions, particularly for the most vulnerable groups in society. 2010s. Crises and populism. Eurozone debt crisis continues, leading to economic and political strain 2010s. The Eurozone debt crisis, which began in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, persisted into the 2010s, putting considerable economic and political strain on several European countries and the EU as a whole. The crisis was triggered by high levels of national debt in several Eurozone countries, including Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, which had been exacerbated by the global recession and the challenges of implementing austerity measures. As a result, many of these countries faced sovereign debt crises, with bond yields rising and concerns about defaulting on debt obligations. In response, the EU, along with the IMF and the European Central Bank ECB, provided bailout packages to Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, often in exchange for stringent austerity measures. The ongoing crisis revealed weaknesses in the Eurozone's architecture, as there was no central fiscal union to manage the economic disparities between member states. The lack of a common fiscal policy and a unified approach to debt management fueled calls for greater EU integration and reform of the Eurozone. Politically, the crisis deepened public dissatisfaction with the EU, particularly in countries hit hardest by the austerity measures. Pro-European political elites came under attack, while populist and nationalist movements gained traction, challenging EU policies and advocating for national sovereignty. The political divide between pro-EU and anti-EU factions deepened, resulting in the rise of anti-austerity parties and the election of far-right and far-left leaders in several countries. 2015 to 2016, European migrant crisis. Over 1 million refugees arrived. Between 2015 and 2016, Europe experienced a massive influx of refugees and migrants, with more than 1 million people arriving, primarily from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and sub-Saharan Africa. The crisis was driven by a combination of armed conflicts, notably the Syrian civil war, persecution, and economic instability in various regions. Many migrants sought refuge in Germany, Sweden, Austria, and other EU countries, leading to the largest movement of people in Europe since World War II. The EU was initially unprepared for the scale of the crisis, and member states were deeply divided over how to manage the flow of migrants. Germany, under Chancellor Angela Merkel, adopted an open-door policy, allowing large numbers of refugees to enter. However, this stance was met with significant backlash in other EU countries and fueled political debates on immigration. In response to the crisis, the EU attempted to coordinate a response, including the establishment of a relocation scheme to distribute refugees more evenly across member states. However, several countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, rejected mandatory quotas, leading to tension within the EU. The crisis also sparked a rise in anti-immigration sentiment and contributed to the growing influence of far-right and populist parties across Europe. The crisis also highlighted issues such as border security, humanitarian aid, and the EU's ability to manage crises effectively. Rise of populism and nationalist parties across Europe 2010s to 2020s. The 2010s saw a significant surge in populist and nationalist political movements across Europe, driven by growing dissatisfaction with the EU, economic inequality, immigration, and globalization. Many of these parties capitalized on anti-elite sentiment, immigration fears, and cultural conservatism, promising to restore national sovereignty and challenge the establishment. Key examples include UK, the Brexit referendum of 2016, in which the UK voted to leave the European Union, was largely driven by Euroscepticism, anti-immigration sentiment, and fears over national identity. The rise of the UK Independence Party UKIP and figures like Nigel Farage played a crucial role in advocating for Brexit. France, the National Rally, formerly National Front, led by Marine Le Pen, gained significant support, particularly in response to concerns over immigration, EU control, and national identity. The party's anti-EU, anti-globalization stance resonated with many voters, especially during periods of economic uncertainty. Italy, the Five Star Movement, and the League, formerly Northern League, both gained popularity through populist rhetoric, criticizing the EU, supporting anti-immigration policies, and calling for more national control over issues like immigration and economic policy. Hungary, Under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, Hungary became a center for nationalist politics in Europe, with Orban's government frequently clashing with EU authorities over issues like migrant policies, press freedom, and democratic backsliding. Poland, the Law and Justice Party, led rose to power with a populist, nationalist agenda, emphasizing traditional family values, sovereignty, and resistance to EU interference, especially over judicial reforms and immigration. Austria. The Freedom Party of Austria FP gained traction with its nationalist and anti-immigration rhetoric, becoming a significant force in Austrian politics. The rise of these parties reflected a broader backlash against globalization and a desire for greater control over national borders. They also often framed themselves as champions of the common people against the elites, including both domestic political elites and EU institutions. This populist wave has challenged the EU's vision of a more integrated Europe, with many populist leaders advocating for a reduction in EU power, the re-establishment of national sovereignty, and stricter immigration controls. (2016) UK votes to leave the EU. Brexit. In 2016, the United Kingdom held a referendum on its membership in the European Union, known as Brexit, short for British exit. The referendum marked a pivotal moment in European history, with the outcome having profound implications for both the UK and the EU. June 23, 2016. In a narrow referendum result, 51.9% of voters opted to leave the EU, while 48.1% voted to remain. The vote was driven by various factors, including concerns over sovereignty, immigration, and the EU's influence on British laws and borders. Key issues driving Brexit. Sovereignty. Many supporters of Leave argued that the UK should have more control over its laws, borders, and trade policies, which they believed were being dictated by Brussels and EU regulations. Immigration. The freedom of movement within the EU meant that citizens from other EU countries could live and work in the UK. This led to fears about immigration levels, putting pressure on public services and jobs, which became a major point for Brexit campaigners. Economic control. The Leave campaign claimed that the UK could regain control over its trade deals and economy by leaving the EU, allowing the country to negotiate its own agreements rather than being bound by EU regulations. Brexit campaign. The referendum was heavily influenced by the Leave campaign, which was led by figures such as Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, and Michael Gove. The campaign was marked by promises of economic independence and the ability to reduce immigration, but it also faced criticism for misleading voters about the potential consequences, including the infamous claim of an extra £350 million per week for the NHS if the UK left the EU. Aftermath. The Brexit vote triggered significant political uncertainty in the UK. Prime Minister David Cameron resigned, and Theresa May became the new PM, tasked with leading the negotiations for the UK's exit. The process was complex and contentious, with numerous debates over the terms of the withdrawal, including the Northern Ireland border issue, trade agreements, and the rights of citizens living in the UK and EU countries. January 31, 2020. After years of negotiations and political turmoil, the UK officially left the European Union, entering a transition period until the end of 2020 to finalize future relationships, particularly concerning trade and regulations. 2019. Brexit negotiations continue under heavy political tension. In 2019, The process of the UK leaving the EU Brexit faced continued political tension and deadlock as the country struggled to reach a consensus on the terms of the departure. Despite the referendum result in 2016, the negotiation process became a prolonged and contentious affair that deeply divided the UK political landscape. Change of leadership. Theresa May, who became Prime Minister after David Cameron resigned in 2016, faced significant challenges in leading the Brexit negotiations. Her deal with the EU, known as the Withdrawal Agreement, was rejected 3 times by the House of Commons in 2019, leading to her eventual resignation in July 2019. Boris Johnson succeeded May, promising to deliver Brexit with or without a deal, and under the slogan, "Get Brexit Done." Johnson's approach involved reopening negotiations with the EU, focusing on securing a deal that would be more acceptable to the UK Parliament, particularly in terms of the Northern Ireland border issue. Key issues in 2019. The backstop. A central point of contention was the Irish backstop, a mechanism aimed at preventing a hard border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, an EU member. The backstop was intended to maintain an open border after Brexit, but was seen by many in the UK as an undue constraint on the country's ability to leave the EU's customs union. This led to fierce debates in the UK Parliament. Trade and future relationship. Another major issue was how to structure the future relationship between the UK and the EU, especially in areas such as trade, regulations, and immigration. The UK sought a free trade agreement with the EU, but discussions remained tense over issues like fisheries, level playing fields, and market access. Political deadlock. The UK Parliament was deeply divided over the terms of Brexit, with Remainers seeking to either cancel Brexit or secure a softer exit, while Leavers insisted on a clean break from the EU. This division led to ongoing parliamentary gridlock, with multiple votes on various Brexit options, none of which succeeded in resolving the crisis. The European Parliament elections in May 2019 saw a significant surge in Brexit Party support, led by Nigel Farage, signaling widespread dissatisfaction with the government's handling of Brexit and further polarizing the political climate. The general election of December 2019. The deadlock led to a snap general election in December 2019, called by Boris Johnson in an attempt to break the impasse. Johnson's Conservative Party campaigned on a promise to complete Brexit, while the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, adopted a more ambiguous stance, supporting a second referendum on Brexit. The election resulted in a decisive victory for the Conservatives, giving Johnson the mandate to proceed with his version of Brexit. This victory enabled him to pass the withdrawal agreement in January 2020, formally setting the stage for the UK's exit from the EU at the end of January 2020. (2020s) Pandemic, War, and Strategic Shifts in Europe. COVID-19 Pandemic 2020 to 2022. Lockdowns, Economic Turmoil, and EU Solidarity. The COVID-19 pandemic had a seismic impact on Europe, bringing lockdowns, economic decline, and a test of EU unity. Countries like Italy, France, and Germany imposed strict lockdowns, overwhelming healthcare systems and disrupting daily life. ICU capacities were stretched, and public health measures such as social distancing and travel bans reshaped society. Economically, Europe entered its worst recession since WWII. Unemployment surged, businesses shuttered, and supply chains faltered. In response, EU countries introduced sweeping economic relief, such as Germany's rescue package and the UK's furlough scheme. At the EU level, rules on state aid were relaxed, allowing national interventions. The EU's recovery fund, known as Next Generation EU, allocated 750 billion euros to drive post-pandemic recovery, with a focus on green and digital transformation. The European Central Bank cut interest rates and pursued quantitative easing to maintain market stability. Vaccine rollout began in late 2020, though the EU initially faced criticism for procurement delays. By 2021, vaccination rates improved, helping ease restrictions. Despite challenges, the crisis promoted deeper EU integration, particularly in public health and economic policy. It also accelerated the shift to digital work and services across the continent. 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, a turning point for Europe. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, escalating tensions that began with Crimea's annexation in 2014. Major cities like Kyiv and Mariupol were attacked, triggering a massive humanitarian crisis and the largest refugee movement in Europe since WWII, with over 7 million fleeing Ukraine. The EU responded with remarkable unity. Harsh sanctions targeted Russian banks, energy exports, and key individuals, including Vladimir Putin. The EU also backed Ukraine with humanitarian aid, military support, and economic assistance. Ukraine applied for EU membership in March 2022 and was granted candidate status by June. Russia's war prompted an energy crisis, as the EU had depended on Russia for around 40% of its gas. The bloc scrambled to diversify energy sources, accelerate green projects, and conserve resources. Coordinated efforts included gas storage strategies and energy price caps. The war also spurred strategic shifts in defense. Many EU states increased military spending, especially Eastern members like Poland and the Baltic states. NATO saw renewed relevance, and the conflict underscored the need for stronger EU defense cooperation. Finland and Sweden joined NATO, a security shift in the Nordics. Historically neutral, Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO in 2022 in response to Russian aggression. Public opinion shifted dramatically, especially in Finland, which shares a long border with Russia. Both nations submitted formal applications in May 2022. Finland officially joined NATO in April 2023. Sweden's accession was delayed due to Turkey's concerns over Kurdish groups, but was finalized in March 2024. Their membership strengthened NATO's northern flank, enhanced security cooperation, and marked a major geopolitical setback for Russia. Europe's energy crisis and inflation surge. The war-induced energy crisis revealed Europe's reliance on Russian fossil fuels. Gas supplies were disrupted, leading to skyrocketing prices, inflation, and rising living costs. Germany and Austria, heavily dependent on Russian gas, were especially affected. The crisis pushed EU countries to prioritize energy independence. Liquefied natural gas (LNG) imports increased, renewable energy projects were accelerated, and countries promoted energy-saving measures. Green transition and digital transformation accelerate. Between 2020 and 2025, the EU made significant strides toward climate neutrality and digital modernization. Green transition. The European Green Deal, launched in 2019, aimed to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. With intermediate targets like a 55% emissions cut by 2030, the EU invested heavily in green energy through the Next Generation EU Fund. Key measures included expanding wind, solar, and hydrogen infrastructure, supporting electric vehicles and public transport electrification, improving building energy efficiency, introducing a carbon border tax to curb emissions-intensive imports, The Ukraine war underscored the urgency of reducing fossil fuel dependency, accelerating clean energy development and grid upgrades. Digital transformation. The EU designated the 2020s as its digital decade, setting ambitious goals. Universal 5G and broadband access. Full digitization of public services. Digital skills for 80% of adults. Growth in AI, quantum tech, and cloud computing. The pandemic exposed digital gaps and drove public investment in infrastructure. Regulations like the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act were enacted to ensure fair competition, data privacy, and cybersecurity. EU enlargement. Ukraine, Moldova, and the Western Balkans. The Russian invasion revitalized the EU enlargement debate. Ukraine and Moldova applied for EU membership in 2022 and were granted candidate status, reflecting both strategic solidarity and commitment to democratic values. Ukraine, despite wartime challenges, made progress on judicial reform and anti-corruption, though hurdles like reconstruction and economic reform remain. Moldova aligned quickly with EU policies, while Georgia's democratic backsliding delayed its candidate status. The Western Balkans, Serbia, Albania, North Macedonia, and others have waited years for progress. Enlargement fatigue and bilateral disputes, such as Serbia's ties to Russia or Kosovo's recognition issues, continue to complicate accession talks. Despite skepticism, the EU renewed engagement with the region, signaling a broader geopolitical interest in stabilizing its eastern flank.